Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. Let me start by saying this up front, because there's been a lot of noise, a lot of headlines, and frankly a lot of lazy takes floating around lately. If you've been following the news, you've probably seen reports claiming the Supreme Court is about to rule, any day now, on the legality of Trump's global tariffs. Some outlets threw out the 9th of January. Others pivoted to the 14th of January. The implication is always the same. The decision is imminent, the stakes are massive, and everything could change overnight. I'm going to argue three things today, and I want you to keep them in mind as we go. First, the outcome of this case is far less mysterious than the media makes it sound. Second, the timing is almost certainly not what you're being told. And third, even if Trump's tariff authority is partially struck down, the idea that tariffs go away is a fantasy, and Washington knows it. This isn't about cheering for or against Trump. This isn't even really about tariffs in the moral sense. It's about how the American system actually works when law, politics, markets, and elections collide, and why that collision almost always produces outcomes that feel counterintuitive if you're only watching headlines. Let's get something out of the way first. When people say the Supreme Court might overturn Trump's tariffs, that phrase alone already hides more than it reveals, because the real legal question here is not, are tariffs legal? Tariffs are obviously legal. Congress has authorized them in multiple statutes over decades. The real question is whether a president can unilaterally impose sweeping, global tariffs by invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, without meaningful congressional involvement, and without a clearly defined emergency that fits the statute's original intent. That's a much narrower question. And once you frame it that way, a lot of the fog disappears. One of the biggest mistakes people make, including professional commentators, is assuming Supreme Court decisions are driven primarily by partisan loyalty. 6 conservatives, 3 liberals, therefore Trump wins or loses. That's not how this court actually behaves, especially on questions involving separation of powers. If you look at the justices not as political avatars, but as people with long documented views on executive authority, administrative overreach, and statutory interpretation, a pattern emerges, and it's not subtle. The 3 liberal justices are the easiest to read. On issues involving expansive presidential power, especially when Congress is sidelined, they are almost uniformly skeptical. There's no real ambiguity there. If this case turns on limiting unilateral executive authority under EEPA, those are 3 reliable votes against Trump's current tariff framework. The more interesting part, and the part most coverage gets wrong, is what happens on the conservative side. Take Neil Gorsuch. He's often labeled a Trump justice. But if you followed his jurisprudence, you know that label is almost meaningless when it comes to administrative power. Gorsuch has been one of the most consistent critics of executive overreach in the modern court. He has repeatedly argued that agencies, and by extension presidents, cannot stretch vague statutes to justify sweeping economic control. In prior cases, he has explicitly warned against turning emergency powers into permanent governing tools. Applying EEPA to impose broad global tariffs without clear congressional authorization fits almost perfectly into the kind of statutory abuse he's spent years pushing back against. In other words, if this case is framed as can the president do this alone, Gorsuch is not a swing vote. He's very likely a vote against Trump's use of EEPA in its current form. That alone gets you to 4 votes. And once you're at 4, the conversation changes dramatically. Chief Justice John Roberts becomes central. Roberts has spent his tenure trying, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to preserve institutional legitimacy. He is deeply uncomfortable with outcomes that suggest the presidency can bypass Congress entirely on major economic policy through creative legal interpretation. Roberts doesn't need to hate tariffs to oppose this. All he has to believe is that taxation and trade policy cannot rest on a single executive signature without some form of legislative participation, and he has said versions of that repeatedly over the years. Then there's Amy Coney Barrett. She's conservative. Yes, but she's also not doctrinaire in the way many people assume. Her record shows a willingness to break with conservative blocs when statutory text and constitutional structure point in another direction. She has already ruled against Trump-era policies before, and importantly, she has shown little appetite for expanding emergency powers beyond their original scope. Put all that together, and a very simple conclusion emerges. It is extremely difficult to imagine a scenario where the Supreme Court fully upholds Trump's current global tariff framework, exactly as it stands. That doesn't mean Trump loses in the way his critics imagine, and it definitely doesn't mean tariffs disappear, but it does mean the court is highly likely to place limits on how EEPA can be used, especially for permanent, across-the-board economic measures. Which brings us to timing, because this is where the media narrative really falls apart. Supreme Court timing is not random. It's not arbitrary, and it's definitely not driven by cable news deadlines. On cases with massive political and economic consequences, the court, particularly under Roberts, practices something legal scholars often describe as political temperature management. That doesn't mean the justices are partisan. It means they are acutely aware of how timing affects legitimacy, public reaction, and institutional authority. Think about the calendar. The 2026 midterm elections are already looming. If the court were to rule too early, say in January or February, the tariff issue would dominate political discourse for the entire year. Every economic fluctuation, every market dip, every trade dispute would be framed through the lens of that decision. The court itself would become the target of sustained political fire. On the other hand, if the court waits too long, closer to the midterms, the ruling would look like direct electoral interference. A decision limiting Trump's economic authority right before voters head to the polls would be impossible to frame as neutral, no matter how sound the legal reasoning. So the court is boxed in, and when you look at that box honestly, the window narrows dramatically. The most plausible timing is late spring to early summer, roughly May to June. That gives enough distance from the election to reduce the appearance of interference while avoiding a year-long political and market meltdown. It also aligns with how the court has handled other high-stakes structural cases in the past, which is why claims about January rulings should be treated with extreme skepticism. They make for good headlines. They do not make sense institutionally. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room. What happens if Trump's use of IEPA is partially struck down? This is where both supporters and critics tend to indulge in fantasy. Critics imagine tariffs collapsing overnight, prices falling instantly, and global trade returning to some pre-negative 2016 equilibrium. Supporters imagine economic chaos, betrayal, and judicial sabotage. Neither is realistic, because Trump, and more importantly, the broader U.S. trade apparatus, has multiple options. Even if EPA is constrained, there are other statutory tools sitting right there, fully legal, fully operational, and already used many times before. Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 is the most obvious. It allows the U.S. to respond to unfair trade practices after investigation. It's slower, it's more procedural, but it's durable. Many of the tariffs imposed during Trump's first term, especially those targeting China, were rooted in 301, not emergency powers. Section 232, tied to national security, is another powerful tool. It's controversial, yes, but it has survived legal scrutiny before. If the administration believes certain imports threaten domestic industrial capacity, it can justify tariffs under that framework. Then, there's Section 122, which almost no one outside trade law circles talks about, but which may be the most important in the short term. It allows the president to impose temporary, across-the-board tariffs for a limited period, up to 150 days, without the lengthy investigative process required under 301 or 232. In other words, even in a worst-case legal scenario for Trump, there is no tariff vacuum. There is no moment where US trade policy simply pauses. What changes is not the existence of tariffs, but the legal justification and the degree of unilateral control. That distinction matters a lot, because markets don't trade on ideology, they trade on predictability. From a market perspective, the worst outcome is not tariffs themselves. The worst outcome is uncertainty, not knowing which legal authority will be used, how long it will last, or whether it can be challenged again. Ironically, a partial Supreme Court limitation that clarifies the rules may actually reduce uncertainty, not increase it. And that's why the idea that a ruling against Trump automatically equals market collapse is deeply flawed. Before we move on, I want to briefly touch on China and Europe, not because this is about them, but because Washington's thinking inevitably runs through those relationships. With China, the key point is simple. Nothing about this case meaningfully reduces US leverage. Most tariffs affecting China are not dependent on EEPA. They are rooted in trade law, industrial policy, and long-standing bipartisan consensus. A Supreme Court ruling on emergency powers does not unwind that structure. With Europe, the picture is more complex. Tariffs justified on national security grounds under Section 232 remain politically sensitive. A shift away from EEPA could ease pressure in some sectors, while intensifying it in others. But from Washington's perspective, the issue is not trade volume, it's how economic disputes intersect with broader alliance management. And that's the lens American policymakers actually use. Not who benefits, but what leverage do we retain, and at what cost. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a situation that feels dramatic, but is structurally constrained. The Supreme Court is likely to limit Trump's unilateral tariff authority under EEPA. It is unlikely to dismantle the tariff regime entirely. The timing will almost certainly be later than the media suggests, and the political fallout will be more balanced and more cynical than either side admits. In Part 2, I want to walk through how both parties are already preparing to weaponize this ruling politically, why neither side is panicking, and how this decision could quietly reshape the 2026 midterm narrative without delivering a clear winner. That's where the real story is. Now, here's where things get genuinely interesting, and where a lot of casual observers completely misread what's happening. If this Supreme Court ruling were truly existential for Trump, or for the Republican Party more broadly, you would expect to see panic. You would expect full-scale messaging campaigns, nonstop pressure on the court, rallies framed around defending tariffs, and an all-hands-on-deck effort to delegitimize any potential limitation. That's not what we're seeing. In fact, what's striking is how calm the Republican establishment has been about this case. There's no mass mobilization, no scorched earth rhetoric aimed at the justices, no sense that a defeat here would shatter the party's economic narrative, and that alone should tell you something important. Republicans aren't calm because they think they'll definitely win. They're calm because they've already gamed out what happens if they lose, or more precisely, what happens if the court partially clips Trump's authority without dismantling the policy itself. That distinction is everything. Let's talk politics for a moment, because this ruling, whatever its exact contours, is going to be politicized immediately. The question is how, and by whom. From the Democratic side, the playbook is pretty straightforward. If the court limits Trump's use of EPA, Democrats will frame it as proof of recklessness. The message will be familiar. Trump overreached, imposed costs on ordinary Americans, destabilized trade, and had to be stopped by the judiciary. But notice something subtle here. Democrats won't lean too hard into legal theory. They've learned that voters don't respond well to abstract constitutional arguments. Instead, they'll translate the ruling into economic language. They'll say uncertainty hurt investment. They'll say prices were pushed up. They'll say businesses delayed decisions because policy kept shifting. Whether or not that's empirically clean is almost beside the point. It's a narrative that feels intuitive, and intuition wins elections more often than spreadsheets. At the same time, Democrats will also quietly benefit from something they don't want to admit out loud. The ruling gives them cover. If tariffs are scaled back or restructured, they can say it wasn't their doing, it was the court. That allows them to criticize the policy without having to own the consequences of reversing it. Republicans, on the other hand, have a very different and arguably more effective angle. They won't frame this as judicial interference with the presidency. That argument plays well in legal circles, but poorly with the broader public. Instead, they'll frame it as judicial interference with the popular will. The shift is subtle, but powerful. Trump wasn't just a president, they'll say. He was elected to disrupt trade orthodoxy, to protect domestic industry, to confront unfair practices. A ruling that constrains his authority becomes, in that framing, a ruling that constrains the voters who put him there. This is not a new strategy, we've seen it before. When Trump was convicted in New York, many assumed it would weaken him politically. In reality, it galvanized his base. The conviction wasn't processed as a legal outcome. It was processed as an attack on identity. The same dynamic applies here. If the court partially strikes down Trump's tariff authority, Republicans won't say the court is wrong. They'll say the system is stacked. They'll shift attention away from doctrine and toward grievance, toward the idea that entrenched institutions are blocking economic self-defense. And that message resonates deeply in regions where manufacturing, heavy industry, and trade exposure are front and center. In those places, tariffs are not an abstraction. They're tied to jobs, wages, and local survival. This is why it's a mistake to assume a Supreme Court loss automatically hurts Trump or Republicans electorally. In some districts, it may actually help. Now let's zoom out and look at the 2026 midterms, because that's where the long-term effects show up. One of the most underappreciated consequences of a Supreme Court ruling like this is agenda distortion. It reshuffles what campaigns end up talking about. Without a ruling, tariffs remain a background issue, important, but diffuse. With a ruling, they become focal. Suddenly, candidates are forced to take positions. Suddenly, trade policy gets pulled into the spotlight alongside inflation, immigration, and national security. Democrats will try to fold tariffs into a broader economic critique, instability, unpredictability, and cost of living pressure. Republicans will tie them to sovereignty, fairness, and resistance to foreign exploitation. And here's the key point. Both sides can make those arguments without contradicting themselves. That's why this ruling doesn't produce a clean political winner. It produces a terrain shift. In swing districts, the effect will vary dramatically based on local economic structure. In service-oriented districts, Democratic messaging may land better. In industrial regions, Republican framing could dominate, which means the ruling doesn't decide elections. It changes what elections are about. Now, let's talk about markets, because this is where people tend to get the story almost completely backwards. Markets do not trade on whether Trump wins or loses. Markets trade on whether uncertainty expands or contracts. Right now, uncertainty is baked in. Businesses don't know whether current tariffs are permanent, whether they'll be challenged again, or whether alternative legal authorities will replace them seamlessly. That uncertainty carries a cost. A Supreme Court ruling that partially limits EPA, but leaves other tools intact actually reduces that uncertainty. It clarifies boundaries. It signals which levers are legitimate and which are vulnerable. If that happens, the most likely short-term market reaction is not panic, but relief, not euphoria. Not a rally fueled by optimism, relief. That typically shows up as modest gains in sectors exposed to trade volatility, retail, logistics, consumer electronics, autos. It also shows up as relative weakness in industries that benefited from tariff protection, like steel and aluminum. This isn't ideological. It's mechanical. Now consider the alternative scenario, the low probability one. Imagine the court surprises everyone and fully upholds Trump's use of EEPA for global tariffs. That would be a shock because it contradicts the prevailing expectation among legal analysts and market participants. Shocks increase uncertainty, and increased uncertainty is almost always negative in the short term. In that scenario, markets would have to reprice inflation risk, supply chain rigidity, and the durability of emergency-based economic governance. That repricing would almost certainly be negative, at least initially. This is why the idea that Trump wins equals markets up and Trump loses equals markets down is so misleading. It ignores expectations, and expectations are everything. Before we wrap up, there's one more layer that's worth mentioning, and it's uncomfortable for people on both sides. The Supreme Court is not trying to save or sabotage anyone. It is trying to avoid becoming the central political actor in American economic life. A ruling that partially limits executive authority without dismantling policy is the most institutionally conservative outcome available. It preserves congressional relevance. It avoids dramatic reversals, and it minimizes the court's visibility as a partisan force. That doesn't mean it will satisfy everyone. It won't. But it does mean the outcome, however it's spun, will reflect institutional self-preservation more than ideological triumph. And that's the part of this story that rarely makes headlines. In the final part, I want to pull all of this together, what this case really tells us about American governance, why so many predictions miss the mark, and why understanding these structural dynamics matters more than getting the exact vote count right. That's where the broader lesson is. So let's pull all of this together, because if you zoom out far enough, this case stops being just about tariffs, or Trump, or even the Supreme Court. It becomes a case study in how American power actually functions under stress. One of the reasons this debate feels so confusing is that people keep asking the wrong question. They keep asking, who wins, Trump or the courts? Republicans or Democrats? Markets or workers? That's a very human instinct, but it's the wrong lens. The better question is, what kind of system is the United States revealing itself to be when all of its pressure points are activated at the same time? You have an executive branch that wants speed, leverage, and flexibility. You have a Congress that has gradually ceded trade authority over decades and now struggles to reassert relevance. You have a Supreme Court that is deeply wary of emergency powers becoming normal governance. You have markets that crave predictability more than ideology. And you have voters who process all of this emotionally, not doctrinally. What you're watching isn't a malfunction. It's the system doing what it always does, bending without breaking. That's why the most likely outcome here is not a dramatic rupture, but a controlled adjustment. The court doesn't need to say Trump was wrong in a moral sense. It only needs to say that the legal pathway he used cannot bear the full weight he placed on it. That's a very judicial move. Narrow, technical, structural. And from the court's perspective, it solves several problems at once. It reins in executive overreach without eliminating policy tools. It nudges Congress back into the picture without forcing immediate legislative action. And it avoids turning the judiciary into the central battlefield of trade politics. Now, here's where a lot of people underestimate Trump and misunderstand American politics. Trump does not need total legal victory to claim political victory. He never has. If the court limits EEPA, Trump can say the system tried to stop him. If alternative tariff mechanisms remain, he can say he found another way. If markets stabilize, he can claim credit. If prices rise, he can blame obstruction. This flexibility is not accidental. It's the product of a political style that thrives in ambiguity. Trump operates best when outcomes are mixed, when institutions constrain him just enough to create friction, but not enough to neutralize him. That's why the idea that this ruling ends Trump's tariff agenda is so misguided. It misunderstands both the legal landscape and the political one. What it really does is change the terrain. Instead of tariffs being framed as an emergency-driven executive action, they become part of a more traditional, messier process. Investigations, justifications, timelines, and trade-offs, slower, less dramatic, but also more durable. And durability matters because one of the quiet truths about American governance is that the most lasting policies are rarely the most aggressive ones. They're the ones that survive court challenges, market reactions, and electoral cycles without collapsing. From that perspective, a partial Supreme Court rebuke may actually strengthen the long-term architecture of America's trade policy, even if it feels like a setback in the moment. Now think about how this lands with the public. Most Americans will not read the opinion. They won't parse statutory language. They won't care about IEP versus Section 301. They'll experience the outcome indirectly through prices, headlines, and political messaging. And that's where both parties will do what they always do: simplify. Democrats will say the court stopped chaos. Republicans will say the court blocked the people. Each side will talk past the other, and most voters will absorb whichever narrative fits their existing worldview. But underneath all of that noise, something more subtle will have happened. The boundary between emergency power and normal governance will have been redrawn. That boundary matters far beyond tariffs. It affects sanctions. It affects industrial policy. It affects how future presidents respond to crises, real or perceived. And that's why this case deserves attention, even if you don't care about trade, because the question it ultimately answers is this: how much economic power can one person wield, and for how long before the system pushes back? The answer, if the court behaves as expected, is not indefinitely and not alone. That's not a partisan answer. It's a constitutional one, and it reflects something deeply American: the constant tension between action and restraint, between efficiency and legitimacy, between what can be done and what should be done through shared authority. So when you see headlines screaming about imminent rulings, dramatic reversals, or economic doom, take a step back. This story isn't moving at the speed of news cycles. It's moving at the speed of institutions. And institutions, for better or worse, move slowly, cautiously, and with an eye toward survival. That's why the most important takeaway here isn't whether tariffs stay or go, rise or fall. It's that the system is once again negotiating its internal limits, quietly, imperfectly, and without giving anyone the clean victory they want. That may not be satisfying. It may not be dramatic, but it's how American power has always recalibrated itself. And understanding that is far more useful than predicting a date on a calendar or a vote count on the bench. That's the real story behind Trump's tariffs, the Supreme Court, and the moment we're living through right now.